Ted Moore nearly lost his grip when he saw a body from 40 feet in the air, clung to the steel frame of a billboard. At first he thought it was trash tossed behind the mall, or a shadow pinned against the wall, but the lens of his phone told him otherwise. A man lay sprawled in the narrow alley, face turned to brick, shirt stained dark across the chest. No twitch of movement. No chance he was alive. Ted's stomach lurched. He snapped a photo, proof it wasn't his imagination, then pressed himself against the metal frame, fighting the urge to climb down too fast. By the time Detective Sergeant Dollinger arrived at the rear alley of Fairmont Mall, the coroner's investigator was already there, cataloging details into a laptop. Yellow tape sealed off the scene, and beyond it, curious onlookers stared at the tarp-covered corpse sprawled in the alley. The coroner's assistant greeted Dollinger grimly and handed him a plastic bag containing the victim's wallet, keys, and phone. The victim was identified as Kent Rollins, 46 years old, a tire distribution salesman living on the outskirts of Weedup. Divorced, estranged, living a quiet and solitary life. He had been shot twice in the chest at close range with a medium-caliber handgun. His shirt was stiff with dried blood, yet the ground beneath the body was spotless. No blood, no trail. He hadn't died here. He had been killed elsewhere and dumped like discarded trash. Time of death, 8 to 12 hours earlier. Dollinger questioned the bystanders, but silence hung in the air. No one had seen or heard anything. He began knocking on doors of nearby houses. An elderly man with unkempt hair and a day's stubble muttered that he hadn't heard unusual sounds. The mall, he said, had been a curse since the day it was built. Cars honking at all hours, alarms blaring at the slightest touch, families piling out with a noise that shattered the night. Everyone Dollinger spoke to had the same complaints. In his car, the detective examined the victim's phone. It was an outdated model, stripped of anything personal, just business messages. Either Rollins had lived a painfully dull, lonely existence, or he had been meticulous in erasing his tracks. His employer was notified. The response was cold. Rollins hadn't been an exemplary worker. He drank too much, called in sick too often. Still, no one could explain why he'd been near the mall that night, or who wanted him dead. Dollinger searched the parking lot. Within minutes, he located Rollins's sleek new sports car. Using the victim's keys, he opened it. Nothing inside but traffic cones and boxes of tire catalogs. No blood, no evidence, just another dead end. By then, the forensic team had arrived. Lieutenant Kestrel photographed the body from every angle before sifting through a metal drum filled with rain-soaked trash, cigarette packs, empty cartons, crumpled newspapers. Nothing useful. As the coroner prepared to move the body to the morgue, Dollinger reported in, but before he could finish his paperwork, his phone buzzed. It was Officer Cameron. She was 3 blocks west on Edison Street. A break-in at a vacant house, copper piping stolen, but Kestrel suspected more than just theft, perhaps even another murder. The house stood at the corner of Edison and Wells. Its paint was peeling, porch steps cracked, though the lawn had been freshly mowed. A faded for sale sign leaned in. The yard. On the porch, Officer Cameron was speaking with a blonde real estate agent, Tammy Lee Winter. She explained that thieves had ripped copper pipes from the walls. But that wasn't all. They had also cut tubing from the central air conditioning unit. The house seemed to be hiding more than stolen metal. The house on Edison Street carried a silent weight, a story etched into its walls long before tonight's intrusion. Tammy Lee Winter, the real estate agent, knew it too well. She explained that the property never sold because its former owner had lost his job, fallen behind on payments, and surrendered it back to the bank in Texas. The bank handed the responsibility of selling it over to her firm, and now the place lingered like a forgotten relic. Earlier that morning, Matt Van Dyke, the caretaker hired by Winter's firm, had come to mow the lawn. Near the end of his work, he noticed a basement window shattered, and further inspection revealed the back stairwell door wide open. Inside, the copper piping was gone. The scene was quiet, eerily so. Winter insisted the crime must have happened at night, since she had shown the house to a potential buyer only the afternoon before, and everything was intact. Then, Officer Cameron added that no one nearby had heard a sound. The elderly couple living next door were nearly deaf. Lieutenant Kestrel was already at work, taking samples of soil, rust, and mold. While they discussed, a man in a hard hat approached, a water meter reader named Hayden Harry. Checking his clipboard, he shook his head and confirmed what they already suspected. The water to this property had been shut off months ago, and the missing copper pipes explained everything. Harry offered to file an immediate damage assessment for the water department. Dollinger agreed, but reminded him that evidence was still being collected. Kestrel confirmed it was safe, and the group followed Harry into the backyard, where an old stairwell led them down into the basement. The air shifted as they entered. At first, the dryness was almost refreshing, but soon the damp, moldy stench pressed against them. The basement lights were weak, forcing Kestrel to set up a portable flood lamp. Harry removed his helmet and began pacing the basement methodically, surveying every corner. Not a single inch of copper had been spared. Dollinger identified himself as public safety, but Harry, unfazed, pointed out something chilling. Though the copper was gone, nearly 100 yards of heavy-gauge electrical cable still clung to the central air conditioning unit. It wouldn't be long before the thieves came back for that too. Kestrel soon rejoined them as Dollinger examined the broken basement window. The thieves had worked with precision, taping the glass before breaking it to silence the shatter. From there, they had slipped inside using a makeshift platform and forced open the outer door, giving themselves easy access to load stolen piping straight into a truck or van waiting in the alley. Kestrel added another layer to the puzzle. Measuring a section of damaged flooring, he explained that the pipes had been cut with a worn tool, dragged back and forth across the metal instead of rotated cleanly. It was crude work, the same technique used at another location he had studied, right down to the telltale plastic tape on the windows. It was evidence, another mark left by the same crew. But Kestrel wasn't satisfied. To him, the real trail would only begin once the stolen pipes surfaced. Scrap yards took in material every day from plumbers, contractors, small companies, and thieves alike. If he kept checking, sooner or later, he'd find their handiwork. The basement wasn't just a crime scene, it was a message. Whoever stripped this house had done it before, and they would do it again. Suspicion was tightening its grip. Kestrel was convinced that the stolen pipe had been cut with the very tool now lying in the caretaker's possession. But it wasn't as simple as it seemed. That cutter had been pulled from the toolbox of the man responsible for maintaining the house and its lawn, the same man who had first reported the break-in. While Kestrel was outside photographing the window the intruder had used, the caretaker quietly went about his routine, pulling tools from his truck as if nothing unusual had happened. The timing was suspicious. As the investigation deepened, the man's casual demeanor began to crumble. He insisted the cutter hadn't belonged to him, that when he arrived that morning it was already lying on the floor beside the missing pipe. Out of habit, he claimed, he had picked it up and added it to his kit. A mistake, he admitted, but one that now placed him in the center of the crime. The detectives pressed harder. He had keys to the house. Why would he need to force entry through a window? His protests grew sharper, but the walls were closing in. When they demanded to search his truck, he reluctantly handed over the keys, certain they would find nothing. The truck stood parked on the corner, filled with the expected clutter: a lawnmower, a fiberglass ladder, tools of the trade. But beneath the surface, something darker lingered. Brown stains smeared across the cargo floor tested positive for blood. That was the moment the case shifted from theft to something far more sinister. Back inside the house, the detectives confronted him with the evidence. He had the keys. He had the cutter. And just 3 blocks away, a man's body had been found, shot dead. Blood was at the scene, and blood was in his truck. The net was closing, and he fit inside it perfectly. As the officers read him his rights, Kestrel was still outside, following faint blood traces across the lawn and tire marks bleeding into the street. The suspect, Van Dyke, was hauled to the 2nd District Headquarters. But he wasn't without resources. Within minutes, he had secured the services of a high-profile defense attorney, Peter, famous for pulling even the worst criminals back into the light of freedom. The moment Peter arrived, Detective Dollinger passed the case to Oberon, who wasted no time reviewing the evidence and preparing for the inevitable clash. Peter moved fast, arguing that his client had never even touched a weapon in his life. He demanded an immediate test of Van Dyke's hands for gunpowder residue and insisted the murder suspicion be thrown out. But the detectives weren't calling it murder yet. Officially, Van Dyke was under arrest for the theft. The lawyer fired back, challenging the charges, demanding a polygraph test, desperate to stay ahead of the case before the detectives could trap his client with their narrative. By afternoon, Van Dyke was transferred to the 1st District Headquarters. Chemical tests revealed no gunpowder residue on his hands. Kestrel, however, wasn't convinced. 6 hours had passed since the killing, more than enough time for traces to vanish. Even so, the results gave the defense exactly what it needed. Van Dyke, despite the mounting shadows against him, walked free on bail. The storm was only beginning. The next morning, newspapers barely mentioned the copper theft. What made the headlines was the killing. At 6 a.m. during the autopsy, The pathologist extracted two .32 caliber shells lodged deep in the victim's chest. Both bullets had torn through the heart and major arteries. The powder burns around. The wounds made one thing clear. They had been fired at point-blank range. Still, the full reports were yet to come. But there was a crucial note attached. During testing in the morgue, traces of gunpowder were found on Rollins's right hand. Suicide was ruled out, but the evidence suggested a firefight. He never got the chance to shoot back. His killer fired first. Kestrel found no usable fingerprints on the shattered window or in the basement, yet the lab results painted a darker picture. The bloodstains found both in the basement and on Van Dyke's truck matched Rollins' blood. Now, there was no doubt. The theft of copper and the murder were connected, and Van Dyke stood at the center of it all. His record did him no favors. Traffic violations, disturbances, petty thefts. Hardly the background of an innocent man. Meanwhile, Kestrel uncovered another detail. The broken basement window had been taped over, but the missing shard was the exact size of a credit card. It wasn't just random tape. Someone had deliberately removed the piece with a bullet hole in it. Kestrel was convinced that shot had come from inside the basement. O'Byrne wasn't so sure. When had that hole been made? Could it have been there for decades? Yet if so, why cover it? Why remove the glass? Someone had tried to erase the mark of a gunshot. That meant whoever was inside had more to hide than a burglary. Later, back at headquarters, O'Byrne discovered a folded green slip of paper left mysteriously on his desk. No signature, no explanation. He tucked his revolver under his arm and followed the lead to Water Street. The sign outside read, Carmela's Beauty Salon. O'Byrne circled around back, knocking on a steel door until it opened. A tall woman yanked him inside and slammed it shut. The salon was dim, lit only by candles glowing in colored glass globes. The air smelled of chemicals, shampoo, dye, disinfectant. Against one wall, a mahogany cabinet held religious icons and framed images watching over the room. Carmela stood before him, apron smeared, rubber gloves clutched under her arm. Her presence was sharp, almost dangerous. She spoke with a knowing edge, hinting at Rollins' double life. By day, a tire dealer. By night, something far darker. He staged his operation like a driving test. Cars lined neatly, spaces measured. But it wasn't practice. It was distribution. Drugs, not tires. She warned him once, then twice. He was free to walk out. But if her granddaughter was harmed, she would come for him herself. By 3 o'clock, Kestrel reported back. Hidden inside the spare tire, he had found the truth. Tiny crystals of cocaine embedded in the rubber cavity. The business was drugs. The copper pipe theft, the blood, the window, the bullets, pieces of something bigger, still tangled, and just as O'Byrne began to connect the dots, the phone rang. It was Rollins' employer Graves. He had seen his car on the news. His only question was simple, and yet loaded with weight. When can I have it back? Graves showed up right on time. Rollins into the public safety garage in a red truck with economy trades stenciled on the side. O'Byrne checked his license, confirmed the lease papers, and then handed him over to Dollinger. What followed was less of a conversation and more of a cornering. Dollinger laid it out straight. The spare tire in Graves's car had tested positive for cocaine. The car was registered in Graves's name. His shock looked genuine, but Dollinger wasn't letting him wriggle out. Graves tried to insist the vehicle had always been in Rollins's possession, that he himself had barely touched it. Dollinger didn't flinch. He showed him the revolver on his hip and told him they were leaving. Next morning brought another twist. Cameron flagged a report. A man named Hayden Harry had been rushed to Manker Memorial after collapsing in his garage. Cocaine overdose. The timing was too neat. O'Byrne and Dollinger paid him a visit. Harry lay in a hospital bed, tubes running from both arms, oxygen mask strapped to his face. He looked half awake, half dead. When pressed, he swore he never touched drugs, said maybe someone slipped something into his food, but his story cracked under the smallest questions. He'd eaten alone, out of a lunchbox locked in his car. His car and not entirely under his control. Back at headquarters, O'Byrne sifted through Kestrel's basement photos again. Something caught his eye. 3 particular shots of what looked like a wall, but the angle told another story. It wasn't part of the basement's original structure. It had been added, nailed to the ceiling beams. A wall hiding something, maybe everything. The photographs revealed something strange. What looked like a partition wall, almost as if it was hiding something. Dollinger studied them carefully, insisting that as far as he remembered, that wall had always been solid, without a single door or passage. To confirm, they contacted the property agent, Timmy Winter, who revealed that 12 years earlier, several renovations had been approved for the house. Among those modifications were a new bathroom, an additional room beside the kitchen, and, most importantly, the basement foundation had been extended. The blueprints clearly showed a partition wall had been built against the back wall of the basement, leaving behind a concealed cavity, 3 feet wide and 12 feet long. Armed with this knowledge, they collected the keys and entered the house. With agents Kestrel and Dollinger assisting, the wall was carefully inspected, and soon enough the truth surfaced. Behind it were 11 large plastic jugs, containers filled with cocaine. Dollinger confirmed that Garrett Graves had been released. For now, though, law enforcement was keeping a close eye on him. The following morning brought heavy rain. Matt Van Dyke stayed home, glued to the television when the investigators arrived. Dollinger confronted him with a detail that didn't add up. Van Dyke had told his lawyer he had never fired a gun in his life, yet somehow, he had known Rollins was shot twice. That information had never been made public. At first, Van Dyke fumbled, claiming he must have assumed it, but the investigators pressed harder. They accused him of moving Rollins's body from the basement to the mall parking lot in the early hours of Monday morning, around 3 or 4 a.m. The same night, someone fired at him, then staged the scene by cutting pipes, leaving behind tools and taping the window to fake a break-in. Van Dyke tried to protest, but their theory was airtight. He had given Rollins a spare key to the side entrance, allowing him to stash cocaine behind the partition wall. When Rollins was shot, Van Dyke panicked. Fearing discovery, he rushed to remove the body. Eventually, Van Dyke admitted giving Rollins the key but denied any knowledge of the drugs. His truck, however, told a different story. It carried traces of Rollins' blood. With that, the officers arrested him. Even if he hadn't pulled the trigger, moving the body and tampering with evidence were serious crimes. Later that afternoon, O'Byrne led Kestrel and Dollinger to test another theory. Their investigation brought them to Frank Open Yard, a scrapyard that operated 6 days a week. The owner balked when the detectives asked to search without a warrant. His eyes darted between them, wary, calculating. Dollinger leaned on the counter, lowering his voice just enough. They weren't there to shut him down, he explained. If the copper they were after turned up, the owner wouldn't be charged with receiving stolen property, provided he gave a straight answer about where he had purchased it. With helmets and gloves on, they sifted through towering piles of pipes, cables, broken boilers, ductwork, and rusted scrap. Minutes later, Kestrel's eyes locked onto a bundle of copper pipes. The cut ends matched perfectly with the cutting tool found in Van Dyke's possession. Frank checked his records and produced a photocopy of the seller's driver's license. The name was Charles Colbert, supposedly from Wilmot. But something didn't add up. The license had expired 4 years earlier, and when checked with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, it was discovered that Charles Colbert had been dead for years. Frank admitted he had only glanced at the license and never compared the photograph to the man's face. The truck the man drove bore the name Colbert Plumbing and Painting, but no such company existed in any business directory. Whoever he was, he had been using a dead man's identity. The investigators took a copy of the license and 2 small samples of the copper pipes for evidence. By Friday morning, Dollinger and O'Byrne paid a visit to Harry. After the usual pleasantries, Dollinger cut straight to the point. On Monday, Harry had claimed he went to the house only to check on damage to the water department's property after the pipe theft. Now, it was time to test the truth of that statement. The noose was tightening and Harry knew it. He had tried to play dumb, insisting he was only there to inspect water damage, but Dollinger and O'Byrne weren't buying it. They laid out the evidence piece by piece: the stolen pipes, the fake license, the trail that pointed directly to him. When confronted, Harry leaned back against the cushion, his face drained of color. The game was up and he knew it. Dollinger opened his briefcase and pulled out the arrest warrant. The charges were clear: multiple thefts, tampering with evidence, and a growing suspicion of murder. Calmly, he ordered Harry to stand, hands against the wall, while the warrant for his home and garage was read aloud. The search was methodical. In the shed beside the house, they found the company truck, just as witnesses had described. Inside it, tucked beneath the floorboards of a toolbox, lay damning evidence: a plastic bottle filled with white crystals, and 2 handguns hidden carefully away. Harry stood in his pajamas and slippers, pale and speechless, as they labeled and packed the weapons. When asked which revolver had punched a hole through the window pane, he admitted it was his. He explained that one gun was fired at his headlights, but the other, the .32 caliber, was the weapon that had ended Kent Rollins' life. He tried to justify himself, claiming he panicked, that Rowling fired first, that his shot was in self-defense. But Dollinger's voice cut through with cold finality. Once a crime is in motion, any death that results is murder. There was no escape from that truth. They gave Harry time to change clothes before leading him away, his fate sealed. Delays at the jail meant booking him took longer than expected. O'Byrne, seizing the moment, went to see Van Dyke, casually dropping the revelation that Rowling's true killer had been caught. Later, as O'Byrne and Dollinger left the prison, a figure appeared. The cunning attorney, Peter. With his eye-cut, fox-like grin, he warned them not to celebrate too soon. If Harry hired him, the case would be anything but easy. O'Byrne didn't flinch. He knew Peter was dangerous, but he also knew one thing. This time, they had enough to fight back.